Before we move on, I would like to offer a few disclaimers about Egyptology and archaeology in general. Archaeology as a field has a lot of baggage, and before even the advent of modern archaeology, in which we still have these popular cultural references like Raiders of the Lost Ark, looting tombs and stealing objects from burial sites, pulling them out and using them for the glorification of modern nations or putting them in Western museums. We had a lot of looting and stealing that meant that so many objects were lost or destroyed or taken out of context. We also have to understand that because this is a death-obsessed culture, so much of the objects are associated with the afterlife and burial practices. And this includes the actual human remains of rulers, of people, of the elite. And much of Egyptology is centered on the exploration and study, and also the exploitation of the dead. These are human remains that were buried in a ritual dedication that was required by the belief system of the time. So often we will see actual human remains in mummy form in museums, and this is problematic. But we do have to understand that we learn a lot from them, but we should also be sensitive to the fact that these were people who lived one day and were buried according to a particular belief system. The other thing that I would like to point out is that often it is glossed over by archaeologists, and the early modern archaeologists certainly came to the study of Egypt with prejudices that were linked to wanting to see Egypt as the foundation of Western civilization by route of Greece and Rome. It's often glossed over that Egypt is actually located in Africa. And as much as Egypt was located in a Mediterranean world, it also was a conduit to the subcontinent of Africa as well. And so we do have that communication and should recognize that association as well. The Nile was also brought cultures northward as well as southward, and we have a very diverse ancient empire that we should understand includes a diversity of people as well. We date the beginning of the ancient Egyptian empire to the unification of Egypt under a single ruler. And that ruler comes to be known as the pharaoh. The pharaoh had absolute authority over the empire. He was a ruler that was a political and religious ruler combined in one single person. The pharaoh had a claim to authority that was based on divine authority. And we saw this in the Mesopotamian region as well, that a leader often claimed a connection to the god in order to justify their authority. It's a bit different in Egypt because the pharaoh was thought to actually be a god and had divine lineage. So not only was he claiming to be a god, but he was descended from a lineage of rulers. The pharaoh was the embodiment of the god Horus during their lifetime, and then when they passed on, they would rise to become Osiris after death. The pharaoh's system was upheld by a dynastic rule, which means that members of the same family would rule in succession. Ideally, this would pass from father to son, but we see that sometimes it would go from from uncle to nephew, or sometimes to a sister or a brother. But eventually, we would have one family that would dominate the history over a certain amount of time until that was challenged. And this was a remarkably stable system throughout Egyptian history. In fact, for 3,000 years, this is a form of government that persisted, and this is longer than any other government in history. The pharaoh's claim to authority was very much set up on a pantheon of gods that legitimized their rule. And I'm showing you here some of the main gods, and I won't talk about all of them, but you should probably recognize the ones that are most frequently depicted in Egyptian art. Egyptians were extremely religious. I think there's probably some debate about this in your book, but religion was central to the everyday life of ancient Egyptians. Religion played a central role in life because it was very much linked to the idea of stability of Egyptian rulership and culture. The pharaoh, as the embodiment of the god Horus, would then rise to be with the gods on their death. And this connection to the divine was something that ensured the peace and stability of the Egyptian society. This communion with the gods meant that they were protected from invaders. They were protected from the forces of nature. And so this relationship between the pharaoh and the divine was central to their idea of life. Again, I'm showing you the most frequently depicted gods, and they are all very much linked to a creation myth, which I'll go into in a moment. We first have Ra, or sometimes called Atum Ra or Amen Ra, who is the principal god and creator of the universe and a source of life. Osiris is his son, the god of fertility, also alcohol and agriculture, the afterlife, and also the god of resurrection. We'll see that he often is depicted with green skin and a white robe, which looks a bit like a mummy robe, a shroud. We also see Horus, who is the god of kingship and the sky. He is the son of Osiris. And Anubis. I found this handy family tree of the pantheon of the Egyptian gods on the internet. And I think it's very helpful to see them laid out in this fashion, because it very much relates to a creation myth that gives identity to these figures and also gives legitimacy to the pharaoh's rule. We see at the top Atum Ra, who's also known as Amen, sometimes known as Ra or Re, and he is the creator god, and later identified with the god of sun. He appeared to the world, and in later times is symbolized through an original mound as a pyramidal stone called the Ben Ben. So when he appeared, he rose on a mound of sand from the Nile. And this is very helpful to understand the form of early tombs. Amen, the supreme god, or Aten as it's written here, created the first of the other gods in Egypt. And according to one version of the myth, the creator either masturbated or spat on the earth and produced Shu and Nefnut, the primary male and female forces in the universe. They got together to give birth to Geb, and the earth god, and Nut, the sky god. And they produced Osiris, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. The oldest of these children was Osiris, who was the god of order. And Egyptians worshipped him as the king who brought civilization to the Nile Valley. His brother, Set, was his evil opposite and the god of chaos. Set murdered Osiris and cut him up into a bunch of pieces, and he scattered them across Egypt and took over Egypt. Isis, who was the wife of Osiris, with the help of Nephthys, who was her sister, but also Set's wife, collected all of Osiris's body parts and used her magic to bring him back to life. And so he is resurrected annually, just like the Nile floods annually. And this is also why we might see Osiris as wearing a mummy's shroud in his depictions of him, because he's in a bunch of little parts and the shroud keeps him together. The resurrected Osiris fathered a son with Isis, Horus, who eventually avenged his father's death and displaced Set as the king of Egypt. Osiris then becomes the lord of the underworld. And so Horus then becomes the god associated with the pharaoh during their lifetime, and Osiris is the god that is associated with the pharaoh after his death. You'll also notice that Nephthys and Osiris get together to produce another god, Anubis, who is the god of embalming and mummification. Because we understand the pharaoh as a god upon their death, we understand that they need grand surroundings in order to bring them into the afterlife. They command people not just during their lifetime, but after their death. And so they are given everything they need to continue that rule. And we'll talk about some of these objects and some of these sites in the following lectures.